Okay, so let's get it started, Tiffany.
Perfect. So to begin, Pulchwelch to as Canuchwin Twelch, we come together to help one another, walking together, decolonizing recognition in practice. And so before we begin today, I would just like to acknowledge where Susan and I are calling in from. The Thompson Rivers University campuses are on the ancestral lands of the Tk'emlúps to Secwepemc, as well as Tk'elch within Secwepemcúlecw, the ancestral and unceded territory of the Secwepemc. The regions that TRU also serves extend into the territories of the Statlium, the Intlaka'pam, the Nuk'chulch, the Chocoltan, the Dechla, and Silks people. Kukshem for sharing this beautiful land. And to the next slide, Andy. Okay, and a little bit about us before we begin. Yedek Shinwenwen or Yedek Shicht, Chiaka Inchquesh, Tiffany Adams, Shama Inchquesh. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning here in BC time, still a little bit. My English name is Tiffany Adams. My Intlaka'pam name is Chiaka. I'm a member of the Lytton First Nation, which is in the heart of the Intlaka'pam territory where the Thompson and Fraser Rivers meet. And I am currently working as the Indigenous PLAR developer here at the Kamloops campus of Thompson Rivers University. And I'll pass it over to you, Susan.
Thank you. Susan Forseille, I'm the PLAR director at Thompson Rivers University, way over in Kamloops, British Columbia. I had the privilege of being born and raised in the territory of Tk'elch, which is the Williams Lake First Nations, or also known as sugarcane. Yeah, I think we'll head to the next slide now, Andy. So I'll quickly share that decolonizing PLAR at TRU has been a process of over the last 8 years. Today, we're going to share a brief history. We're going to share a little bit about how we've built co-created pathways, what our goals are, growth and transformation over these years, what our future directions are, and a few final words. I don't think we'll have time for questions and comments, but you do have our contact information, and we do encourage that. We'll go to the next slide, where I'm just going to share a really quick overview of a brief history of decolonization at PLAR. And as you'll notice, the tree image on the side of the screen shows a process of growth with each step we have taken has extensive reflection built into it, not just with us, but with others that we're working with. We've adjusted it as needed before we take that next step. So to break everything up into 5 phases is somewhat artificial because we do this reflection through each of it. But there is some fairly large patterns that I can put into the foundation phases. So it started way back in 2018 when we knew we needed to decolonize and reduce the colonized ways we were doing things. So it started with some research on who has done this type of work, how have they done it, how do you center Indigenous knowledges? That led into an early change phase where the very first thing we needed to do is understand what are culturally safe practices and how do we make sure we do them before we start working with students or candidates. And so we took time and care to do that also during the pandemic at the same time. And then once we had a sense of trust that we weren't going to do harm, we began to work with communities in earnest, building relationships and starting with a couple of pilot projects, working with Indigenous learners and finding ways for them to reflect, share, and have their learning validated. Once we got a better understanding of that, and Tiffany joined our team, we were able to start doing this work in more volume, working with more students, and again, still co-creating pathways, processes with students and with communities, and that was vital to do it with them. We're currently in phase 5, where we are now celebrating the first candidates graduating. Today we have 2 ceremonies. 2 Fridays ago, we had 25 candidates cross the stage graduating. And we're working with TRU, our university, to support the growing demand. Next slide.
Okay, so today I would like to share a bit of our journey for building these co-created pathways with Indigenous communities and how this work has influenced the evolution of prior learning assessment and recognition at Thompson Rivers University. More importantly, though, I want to reflect on what we've learned in creating these assessment processes that honor the Indigenous knowledges and support the diverse ways of learning and fostering that sense of belonging and representation for the Indigenous PLAR candidates that we have been supporting. At its core, this work has always been about recognition. It has been about recognizing that learning happens in so many different ways, different places, and throughout a person's lifetime. It's also about recognizing the traditional assessment systems have not always reflected or valued the full range of knowledge and experiences that people bring with them. And we've noticed that especially with Indigenous students. One of the most significant shifts in the work has been moving from designing pathways for Indigenous candidates to designing pathways with them. Rather than expecting the Indigenous learners to adapt themselves to these existing systems, we welcomed and invited them to shape this process. And the Indigenous PLAR candidates co-created these pathways that reflected how their learning was developed and how it could be best shared and validated. This approach acknowledged that these individuals are the experts in their own experiences, and that meaningful assessment should provide opportunities for those experiences to be recognized. This co-creation process challenged us as a post-secondary institution to think differently about assessment. Instead of focusing solely on standardized forms of evidence, we began asking questions such as, what does the knowledge look like here? How has this learning occurred? Who has the authority to speak to this learning? And how can the assessment processes honor both the academic and community and Indigenous understandings of competencies and expertise? And without surprise, the answers to these questions could not come from Thompson Rivers University. They emerged through the collaborative partnerships with the Indigenous PLAR candidates and Indigenous communities. Community members, elders, knowledge holders, Indigenous educators, and leaders provided such valuable guidance through this work. They helped us understand that learning is deeply connected to relationships, culture, community, and place. The perspectives encouraged us at TRU PLAR to move beyond those transactional approaches to assessment and towards processes that are grounded in respect, reciprocity, and trust. And so these partnerships also highlighted the importance of community-informed approaches to learning recognition. Rather than relying exclusively on institutional definitions of knowledge, we sought ways to include that community perspective in determining what learning looks like and how it should be validated. The shift has not always been easy, but it has created opportunities for richer and more meaningful approaches to recognizing learning. The next slide, Andy. And so one of the key goals throughout this journey has always been the integration of Indigenous knowledges, ways of knowing, and diverse epistemologies into TRU PLAR assessment practices. And when I talk about epistemologies, I'm talking about our ways of knowing, how knowledge is created and understood. Many educational systems in Canada have historically privileged Western academic approaches to knowledge. While these approaches do have some value, it is important to note they are not the only valid ways of understanding our world. Indigenous knowledge systems offer perspectives that are holistic, relational, experiential, and interconnected. Knowledge is often passed through stories, observation, participation, mentorship, ceremony, and relationships with families, communities, and the land. And these ways of knowing have sustained our Indigenous peoples for generations. Recognizing this means expanding assessment practices beyond these colonial frameworks. Traditional PLAR assessments relied heavily on written documentation, standardized demonstrations of learning, and the top-down approach of the assessors guiding how this process should go. So it's no surprise that these traditional forms of PLAR assessment would not capture the depth and complexity of the learning that an Indigenous PLAR candidate has acquired, especially through things such as community leadership, cultural practices and knowledges, language revitalization, caregiving responsibilities, land-based learning, and other lived learning experiences, just to name a few. So as we broadened our approach, we began exploring more inclusive, culturally responsive methods of assessment. Storytelling became a meaningful way for the Indigenous PLAR candidates to share their learning journeys. Reflective narratives provided opportunities to connect their experience with competencies. Oral presentations and conversations allowed for them to demonstrate their knowledge in ways that felt authentic and right for them. Community validation and references in terms of conversations with one another from respected leaders from within the community provided context and credibility to lived experiences that might have otherwise been unrecognized. And so these approaches expanded our understanding at TRU PLAR of how learning can be demonstrated and ultimately assessed. And I just wanted to share that in the words of one of the validators or the assessors that we had worked with, when initially meeting with the Indigenous PLAR candidates, he had shared, "I'm not grading you on how much you know. I don't have a checklist or anything like that. You tell me what I need to know. This is about your journey." So perhaps one of the most important outcomes of this work has been the opportunity to create environments where Indigenous candidates feel genuinely seen. And representation and belonging are not simply the aspirational goals of our work. They're essentially conditions for learner success. And so when Indigenous PLAR candidates see themselves reflected in processes, policies, decision-making structures, along with their assessments, they are more likely to feel valued and respected. And so, as we know that educational systems historically have been associated with exclusion, assimilation, and barriers to participation for Indigenous learners. So creating these culturally responsive assessment pathways helped address some of those legacies by affirming that Indigenous identities and knowledges systems belong within our institutions. And this affirmation matters, and it sends a message that Indigenous knowledge is not something to be othered or marginalized. It is something to be respected, recognized, and celebrated at a post-secondary institution. Our next slide. And so our journey has been one of continuous growth and transformation. The Indigenous PLAR practices we have developed look very different from the traditional pathways that are offered at TRU. In working with Indigenous students and communities, what we quickly realize that true recognition involves more than evaluating evidence. It requires building relationships and creating spaces for different perspectives. As our understanding evolved, so did our practices. We moved towards more relational and community-grounded approaches. We became more intentional about our consultation, collaboration, and shared decision-making. One lesson is that trust takes time. Meaningful partnerships can't be rushed. Another lesson is listening is often more important than leading. Some of our most significant improvements emerge from not having answers and from being willing to hear concerns, receive feedback, and adapt our approaches. We've also learned that transformation is rarely linear. There have been challenges, some setbacks, and difficult conversations, yet each challenge has provided an opportunity for learning and growth. And at the same time, we've celebrated important milestones. Every successful assessment pathway, every strengthened community partnership, and every learner who has had their knowledge recognized in a meaningful way represents progress towards a more equitable system. So I just wanted to discuss this graph that's on the screen here. The past 2 years, you can see that we had completed 7 Indigenous competency-based portfolio assessments, and 52 Indigenous course-based PLAR challenge. And from the Indigenous course-based PLAR challenge, we had, I know it says 5, but we had 4 core courses that we were able to establish for many of the Indigenous PLAR candidates. 2 First Nation Studies courses, a course in the Regenerative Agriculture program called Secwepemc Laws of the Land, and a Community Service Learning course at the 1000 level. We are working on establishing the 3000 level. So in total, and with that, we have a number of pending assessments. 44 for waiting for the Indigenous competency-based, 183 for those 5 core courses, including a 3000 level of the community service. And the final bottom number there, 247. So that's Indigenous course-based PLAR as well. That includes those 5 core courses at the top, but also other things such as physical education, anthropology, archaeology. The candidates that we've been working towards are inquiring about other courses outside of those realms. So yeah, next slide, Andy.
Tiffany, we have just maybe another minute or 2.
Okay. So our future directions include continuing to strengthen relationships and deepen trusts within Indigenous communities. And these relationships must remain central to our efforts and continue to guide our decision making. But ultimately, this work is more about assessment. It's about honoring the people that we've been able to work with, their relationships and their knowledge. And it's about creating a system that respects multiple ways of knowing and supporting learners and bringing their whole selves into educational spaces such as Thompson Rivers University. And most importantly, it's about ensuring that Indigenous learners are not merely included in our systems, but active partners in shaping them. And we could go to the next slide.
This next slide is very busy. I really just wanted to share 2 important pieces from it. We have had a profound change, as expressed in this image, in how we understand decolonization. We have moved from how do we fit Indigenous knowledge into existing systems at TRU or other Western institutions, to asking ourselves, how must our systems evolve and change to genuinely and authentically recognize multiple ways of knowing? And this leads me to the esteemed elder C.C. DeRose. Last year, she published a memoir, and it was called We Have One Arrow Left. And in it, she shares that we have one arrow left in our quiver, and that is education. We must use it wisely. C.C., we are working really hard to follow this teaching and to respect and honor Indigenous knowledges. That takes us to our last slide. And I'm going to leave final words. We were going to share a video, a 2-minute video, but I'll put that in the chat as soon as we finish. But what I do want to share is something that an education director from Eskedam, one of the communities we've been working with, he shared, your team has made what may have been a very difficult path back into education, one the Eskedam could walk safely and with pride. Your support along this journey is immeasurable, and this is where it gets really important, in terms of giving back our members confidence, self-worth, pride, and optimism and going forward. The 2 images here, we have an image of a woman who just graduated, took her 40 years to finish her degree, and she finished it with the support of PLAR. And then Elder Dave Bulio, if you're able to watch the video, he has some profound words he shares about 44 seconds into the video that really encapsulate what PLAR is about and what we're trying to do with the decolonization. I'll leave with just last words from the late Honorable Minister Murray Sinclair. He was the former chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, and he shared, and I know this is often quoted, education got us into this mess, and education will get us out of it. So thank you, everybody. And if you just want to go to the next slide, it has information from us in terms of how to contact us. But do reach out if you have any questions and or put them in the chat. We'll be monitoring them as well. And I'll share the link to that 2-minute video. It is, I read in the chat, there were some tears earlier. This brought tears to my eyes when I saw it. Most of the students, over half the students in the video went through PLAR.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, everybody.